I'm Julie Stelton, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. A Canadian small business group is calling on the federal and provincial governments to temporarily eliminate or lower fuel taxes. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says record gas prices, supply chains, entanglements, and labor shortages have pushed the cost of doing business through the roof. It says higher transportation and fuel costs have driven 92% of small businesses to increase prices in the past year. For more on this, along with other requests to governments amid the Council of the Federation's summer meeting, we are joined by CFIB's Vice President of National Affairs, Jesmond Gonnet. Mr. Gonnet, thank you for being back with us on Forum Daily.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The CFIB is asking governments for fuel tax relief. Why is this important to your members?
Right now, fuel and energy are the top concern for small business owner. It's the major cost constraints that all small businesses are facing, and why we are asking the federal government and provincial governments to reduce a fuel tax to help small businesses deal with the increased cost of doing business, especially regarding fuel and energy costs.
Besides fuel, what are some other requests you hope governments consider for your members?
Yes. Well, first is to find solution to help small businesses deal with the increased cost of doing business. So, for example, reducing payroll taxes, reducing the carbon tax, lowering the small business tax rate, all this to help businesses deal with inflation cost. Put in place policies to find a solution and ease the current shortages of labor. As you know, all businesses in all sectors across the country are having difficulties hiring employees, and so shortages of labor is quite an important issue right now. And we're asking also for COVID-related debt relief. With 2 years of lockdowns, many small businesses are facing a huge amount in COVID-related debt.
In a recent press release, you are asking for governments to address internal trade barriers. What is the cost of these barriers to the economy?
Yeah, good question. A few years ago, the CFIB and other organizations estimated the cost of interprovincial barriers at around $14 billion. So that's a huge number. It represents time and money for a business owner to comply with different rules, sometimes conflicting rules from one province to another, from one province to a territory. And so it's quite expensive for small businesses, and it's quite costly for the entire economy.
The economy has continued to emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the major concerns for your members as the recovery continues?
Well, as I mentioned, the increased cost of doing business, every single budget line of a small business is increasing. And so there's got to be policies helping small businesses to deal with that. As I mentioned, shortages of labor. We see signs out there almost on every storefront. So shortages of labor, cost of doing business. Supply chain disruption is another major issue facing small businesses. As I mentioned as well, COVID-related debt. And so as we move out of the pandemic, I think the policies that are put in place should be helping businesses to cope with the current inflation that we are all facing.
Thank you so much for your time today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure.
After the break, we take a look at Canada's public health system in crisis. Our interview with Pauline Worsfold, Secretary Treasurer at the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, unpacks staffing shortages, forced overtime, and canceled vacations for nurses, and what her organization is asking from Ottawa and provincial governments. So stay tuned. We'll be back after the break. Stay with us. Canadian nursing leaders say they've sent a message to the premiers during their meeting in Victoria, BC this week that patients and nurses are suffering through a dire staffing crisis that threatens the sustainability of public health care. A statement from Linda Silas, president of the Canadian Federation of Nurses, says the system is on the brink of disaster, and nursing leaders shared proposed solutions with Canada's premiers. Ms. Silas says nurses have been struggling through extreme staffing shortages, forced overtime, and canceled vacations. With no end in sight to untenable conditions, the CFNU says its proposals focus on retaining nurses, encouraging them to return to the profession and the public healthcare system, and new measures to recruit and train the next generation. Joining us to discuss the current state of Canada's public health care is Pauline Worsfold, Secretary Treasurer at the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions. Welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by giving us a brief overview of the situation currently facing public health care in Canada?
Well, you did a good preemptive description there when you said it's the working conditions are untenable. Nurses are working huge amounts of overtime, including 24-hour shifts in some provinces. There are just no nurses to replace the current nurses who are on shift. Huge amounts of overtime, not being able to take time off to rest and recover. And the system, the people within the system are broken.
What are the main causes for these staffing shortages, do you think?
Well, this is not new, I have to say. We've been sounding the alarm for the past 10 years that we had a nursing shortage over the last 10 years. And of course, the pandemic has only made it worse. It's, magnified the problem, and it's staff shortages related to cutbacks over the previous 10 years, regarding financial cutbacks. Beds in the system have been cut back, so therefore patients face longer wait times, and it's not new.
How has the pandemic impacted the healthcare system staffing situation across the country? You mentioned a couple things. Is there any more than that?
Well, it's made it worse. The pandemic has made it worse because not only do the staff unfortunately contact COVID, but so do their family members. And then that takes them away from work because you can't come to work if you're sick. And so that plus the burnout. We have nurses that we had a survey done earlier this year that showed 50% of nurses were looking at leaving their current job, and 20% of that 50% were considering leaving nursing altogether.
In that line, what will the public healthcare system look like in a year or so if nothing changes?
Well, that's not an option. Something has to change. And coming out of the Premier's meeting, we need action, and we need action right away. We want the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments to work collaboratively to come up with solutions to fix the problem. And we offered solutions in the public system too, I must add. There is no room for a parallel private system. It would just siphon resources, human resources and financial resources away from the public system. So there's no room for a private for-profit system in this country at this time.
So what is your organization urging governments to do to address the situation?
We're encouraging all levels of government, provincial, territorial, and the federal government to come together and listen to the nurses. We have solutions. we're looking at our 3 Rs: retaining, re-entry, and recruiting. And I would add a 4th R: you have to do it with respect. And if you can retain the nurses that are in the system, how you're going to do that is you're going to fix the working conditions. The workloads are unbelievable. And the conditions of work are the conditions of care. And our nurses are at the breaking point, and some of them have broken and have left.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
After the break, a look at oligopolies in Canada. We speak with Mr. Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited, following the Rogers service outage. So stay tuned to Forum Daily Week in Review. We'll be right back after the break. A legal expert says Rogers Communications' move to credit its customers with the equivalent of 5 days of service following a massive outage is wholly inadequate. Rogers made the announcement on Twitter on Tuesday, calling it a first step in earning back its customers' trust. But York University professor Richard LeBlanc calls it a minimum. Dr. LeBlanc says 5 days compensation is based on the idea that the damage can be quantified solely as a proportion of a monthly fee. But he says for some customers, the cost of missed sales and canceled payments would be broader than that. But the outage affected many Canadians and in many different ways. It has led some to ask questions about oligopolies in Canada. With us now is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Welcome back to Forum Daily, Brendan.
Julie, always great to be here.
The Rogers outage last week affected many Canadians, and for some, the service outage focused attention on Canadian oligopolies. What is an oligopoly?
Well, it's a nice way of saying a cartel. It means a group of companies, could be 2 companies, in which case it'd be a duopoly or more, but a limited group of companies that control a market. If they act in concert with each other, they can maximize their profit, perhaps to the detriment of customers. But there are advantages, and Canada has a lot of oligopolies in all kinds of different industries.
Does Canada have an oligopoly problem?
Well, that's a good question. Depends what you call a problem, because everybody's, any bug is somebody else's feature. So advantages to oligopolies, at least the way they're practiced in Canada, is that things tend to run smoothly until, like with the Rogers situation, they don't. So examples, we have 2 railroads, CN and CP. We have essentially 2 airlines, WestJet and Air Canada, but Porter flying out of the island terminal is pretty fun too. But we have the handful of banks, literally a handful of 5 major banks, Scotia and TD and the rest. And then we have, as we're talking about now, a limited number of cell phone carriers, and that number is getting ever smaller. Is it a problem? Again, only if things go wrong or if they work in concert together to really boost prices. And I think that's been the ongoing complaint for Canadians about these different industries, is that our prices are relatively high compared to what people pay in other parts of the world.
In the United States, there are people calling for giant tech companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon to be broken up. Should Canadians be calling our companies to be broken up?
I think of different situations. So when they, for example, in the United States, broke up the railroads at the turn of the 20th century, or AT&T at the end of the 20th century, you had monopolies, literal one company industries that needed to be broken up. And that was very good for America because a lot of competition sprung up. But I think the end result is what you want. I don't necessarily want to break up Bell or Rogers or the banks, but what I think we need to do is create an environment where competition is possible. Because one of the things that oligopolies do is use their pricing power, the relatively low cost of capital, to put the squeeze on any new startup. So I think it behooves governments to make the extra effort in these areas where there are these seemingly natural Canadian oligopolies, to make it easier for independent competition to spring up.
How might oligopolies impact the Canadian consumer in terms of competitive advantage or in terms of choice for those shopping around for the best price?
Well, it's the prisoner's dilemma. It's that whole mathematical concept in the Russell Crowe movie, A Beautiful Mind, where if a small group of individuals or corporations work together, they can work to their mutual advantage. And whenever companies get together, even for merriment or amusement, it almost always ends with a conspiracy against the public. So when an oligopoly switches to a cartel, that's when the pricing's the same, the services are the same, the products are the same, and yet the prices are higher than they should be. That's the argument that's made about Canadian cartels. And I think there is some truth to it, not to say that the telecoms are operating as a cartel, but there is a natural tendency toward this cooperative prisoner's dilemma behavior, which does work against the public. So I don't think the solution is necessarily breaking it up, but simply making it easier for independent competitors to provide genuine choice.
Well, thank you so much for your input as always.
Thank you, Julie.
Next, an interview with Jonathan Berkshire Miller discussing what the results of Japan's elections mean after the death of Shinzo Abe. The party of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is vowing to finish his work days after Abe was shot dead at a campaign event. The Liberal Democratic Party and its junior coalition partner secured a majority in the parliament's upper house in Sunday's elections. The result means Abe's successor, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, could rule uninterrupted until a scheduled vote in 2025. It also allows him to work on Mr. Abe's unfinished goals, including strengthening the military and even revising the country's pacifist constitution. Joining us to unpack the election, Mr. Abe's legacy, and what it all means for Japan and the greater region is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is also a Senior Fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Miller, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on.
Let us start with the assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. What has been the impact in Japan?
Well, I think Japan, as much of the world, has been deeply shocked by this incident. First of all, political violence like this is a rarity in Japan. Gun violence itself, actually, is a rarity in Japan. And not only this, but I think Abe himself was a giant on the international stage and a giant in Japan. Not everyone necessarily agreed with his policies, but he was Japan's longest serving modern day prime minister. And I think his death really was a bit of a political earthquake to many in Japan.
What is the significance of Mr. Abe's legacy, both in Japan and the Indo-Pacific region?
I think Abe's death and his legacy and his life, I think, will be felt quite a bit in this part of the world. Frankly, Abe was a strong leader in a period where there wasn't much leadership. You look around the G7 even now, obviously we've seen what's happened in the UK with Boris Johnson's removal. There really isn't much leadership right now in the G7. There isn't much leadership in the G20. We see authoritarians on the march, whether it's in China or Russia. Abe, during his time, was a strong leader. He stood up for the international rules-based order. He promoted free trade and strong international institutions that could be resilient against these authoritarian threats. And I think that's going to be a legacy that he leaves.
Fumio Kishida, Japan's PM, has seen his majority increase in the upper house. How do you expect this to impact government policies moving forward?
So I think Kishida predictably was able to get a strong majority now. The Liberal Democratic Party, which he leads, continues to be a stalwart in Japanese politics. I think we can see consistency rather than any sort of disruption in Japanese politics. Japan will continue to be a strong voice for ensuring a strong rules-based order in this part of the world. Although I do worry the fact that Kishida is a strong leader. He's following many of the policies of Abe, but he doesn't necessarily yet have that stature that Abe had. So whether he can sort of fulfill that in his coming years is an open question.
So what are the main strategic issues for Japan in the Indo-Pacific region?
I think Japan, frankly, lives in a bit of a challenging part of the world. Obviously, its neighborhood, it has the relationship with China, territorial disputes with China. It also has an increasingly fractious relationship with Russia to its north, which it also has a territorial dispute with, in addition to the challenges of North Korea and its continued advancement of its nuclear and ballistic missile weapons program. So Japan has a host of different challenges, and frankly, its economy is very much reliant on the interdependency of these economies. So any challenge, whether it's over Taiwan, whether it's over North Korea, directly will impact Japanese security and its economy.
We know the Quad is important to Japan's security. How is this alliance important to the Indo-Pacific region and Canada's strategic interests in the region?
Well, I think the Quad is a recognition that while multilateralism has some impact and some effect, that it's maybe a necessary but insufficient way to deal with some of the challenges in this region. Frankly, the United Nations is not going to resolve some of the challenges that we face, especially in this part of the world. And the Quad is an outgrowth of that. I think the Quad, being Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, have aligned together, not necessarily to contain China, but to stand up for what they think is right in this region. And what is right is often shared interest, shared values of democracy, and a shared sense of the rule of law being primacy, having a prime element in international affairs.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm Julie Steltlin, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. For more news on demand, you can visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Have a great weekend, everyone.